My name is Rosário Salema de Carvalho. I am the coordinator of the Azulejo Research Network, which is part of ARTIS, the Institute of Art History of the University of Lisbon. I will be hosting this session together with my colleague Vera Maris.
Hi, everyone.
On behalf of my research group and our partner, the National Azulejo Museum, I would like to welcome you all. This is the first session of this new season, and the first 3 AzLabs will be dedicated to museum collections. Today, our invited speaker is Femke Diercks, Head of Decorative Arts and Curator of European Ceramics at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. Thank you so much, Femke, for having accepted our invitation and found room for this talk in your schedule. I'm very glad to introduce you today. So, Femke Diercks holds a degree in art history from the University of Groningen, and she was introduced to decorative arts during an internship in the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem. As she mentioned in a recent online post, it was love at first sight. So her master thesis focused on the collection of a patrician family from Amsterdam. And shortly afterwards, she applied for a position as a junior curator of decorative arts at the Rijksmuseum. And she has been with the museum since 2009. She also worked at a museum in Leiden, but she returned to the National Museum in 2012 and was directly involved in the actual placement of the ceramics and glass collections in the galleries for the reopening in 2013. Then she co-curated a great exhibition, Asia in Amsterdam, Luxury in the Golden Age. And she is currently working on an exhibition about the Dutch interiors in the 17th century and the Delftware collection of the Rijksmuseum to be launched in 2025. Besides, Femke wrote many articles in specialized journals and, of course, major contributions to exhibition catalogs. Today, Femke Diercks will speak about the hidden history of tiles in the Rijksmuseum, offering an overview of the collection and its display history. Just before starting, I would like to remind you that during the talk, you can write your questions and comments on the chats. In the end, we will pick up some of them. And of course, we will have room for a Q&A where you also be able to write down your questions or use the raise hand tool to ask your questions directly. Finally, AzLab is sponsored by the publisher Centro Atlântico, whose generosity we would like to acknowledge. And now I turn you over to Femke Diercks.
So thank you so much for this introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to Rosario, to Vera, to the people involved in the I'm gonna try Azulejo research network. I'm very sorry for botching your beautiful language even before I've started properly. As Rosario said, I want to focus on the history of collecting and display of tiles in the Rijksmuseum. And interspersed, I hope to show some of the most beautiful examples in our collection. The Rijksmuseum at the moment, the displays were reinvented during this large renovation that we went through and the reopening of the museum in 2013. We show about 8,000 works of art now and showing the history of the Netherlands from the Middle Ages to today in a chronological and mixed media display. Tiles, I think, play a relatively minor part in this display, too minor, I'm sure present company would agree, but this was not always the case. The building as we know it opened in 1885, but the last galleries weren't finished until about 10 years later. And the Rijksmuseum brought together three very different institutions under one roof: the National Art Gallery for paintings, the National Print Room, and the, it's a really difficult sort of phrase to translate, but the Nederlandisch Museum for Art and History. And this Nederlandisch Museum, or Nederlands Museum, had a very particular focus. It's wanted and collected, and I quote, the history of civilization of the Dutch people. So it had a very cultural, historical emphasis that was on par with nationalistic tendencies in museums founded at the end of the 19th century, but had much less of a focus on crafts, like other decorative arts museums founded in this period, such as the South Kensington Museum, the predecessor of the V&A, or the Decorative Arts Museum in Vienna. The Netherlandish Museum was also in part inspired by the great exhibitions held in that time that very much focused on national achievement. In fact, the colonial exhibition held in 1883 in Amsterdam was in part held in the then still unfinished Rijksmuseum building. And the Hindeloper room that we see here was installed for the exhibition, but remained in the museum after it opened in 1885. Hindeloper was a village in the south of the province of Friesland in the north of the Netherlands. And the particular style of dress and heavily decorated furniture became a sort of height of Dutch folklore at the end of the 19th century. And so this room had a very significant folkloristic aspect to it. But it did mean that the museum, at least initially, showed a wider variety of material culture than museums did that had this purely decorative arts focus. When we look at the picture of the room, you can see this sort of horror vacui decorations with tiles included in the windowsills. Here, I'm trying to see, can you see my pointer? Here, you can see here tiles even included in the windowsills. And you can see just how staged these presentations were. I'm just going to turn off my pen again. This is not easy. Okay, you can see just how staged these displays were when you compare it to late 19th century paintings that of Hindeloper scenes that also have this folkloristic and romantic tendency. I mean, it's almost a one-on-one copy. These great exhibitions also led to purchases of tiles from other parts of the world. This tile panel entered the collection of the Rijksmuseum at the time of the colonial exhibition and had been part of the Tunisian pavilion at the fair that included a replica of a Tunisian mosque that this panel was a part of. When the entire museum opened in the 1890s, you can see that the smaller galleries on the lower left were decorated to the interior, and so to the Netherlandish Museum. And these galleries were crammed with lots of I'm very sorry. I'm trying to use the pointer, but it's distracting me. These galleries were crammed with all sorts of architectural elements, and you see an image here of it. And that created a setting for displays that were very much like period rooms. And tiles had a natural role to play here. They were incorporated in and around chimneys, as you can see here in this view painted by a Dutch painter. And you can see the tiles included there, and these are actually come from panels that we still have in the collection today of these almost life-size Roman soldiers. And you can see that it has a very architectural feel to it. They almost function like an extra console inside the hearth. These invented period rooms in the early Netherlandish Museum were initially quite popular, but soon ensued criticism. Their picturesque quality was increasingly seen as cluttered and even ahistorical, and this critique was not entirely unfounded. When we look at this image of a gallery that was sort of the annex to a room that was installed like a 17th century kitchen, you can see that actually many of the tiles that were on display here were not 17th century, but mid 18th century. And again, you can see the examples here in our collection. Particularly nice, I think, is this is the in de Rozenboom that was used as a cable stone for a house in Den Bosch. The house was demolished at the end of the 19th century, and it was bought by the museum. Here we see another example of this sort of picturesque display and a sort of mishmash of different objects brought together. The mantle itself it has 16th century carving, but the pilasters are actually casts from a hearth in a house in Zaltbommel that was said to have belonged to a famous Dutch knight. And in the chimney itself, we see a combination again of those two pilaster figures in the hearth. This time of again of sort of these Roman figures, but then combined with these hearth tiles and a fireback. So the elements together do give a context to the display and a context to the way that tiles would have originally functioned. But the combination itself is essentially pure fantasy. Important tiles were purchased in this period precisely because of this idea of creating settings, but also this idea of collecting civilization. And really important tiles entered our collection in this period, such as this panel from an orphanage in Sommelsdijk in Zeeland. The orphanage was demolished, and the museum very soon after bought it from the city council that had owned the building. And again, you can see in the drawing this sort of imagined display being created, this invented period room. Also bought in this period in 1883 is this incredibly pivotal object in our collection, because it shows the entire process of the production of tiles. It was made in Harlingen, but for a bull to celebrate the founding of a Bolsward tile and ceramics factory. And of course, it's absolutely wonderful because you can see literally all the stages of tile production, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this object. Particularly lovely, I think, are the tile windows that were used to form and roll out the tiles, that you can also see in the coats of arms of no less than 3 of the founders of this Bolsward factory. And the separate painter's house on the lower left, where you see stacks and stacks of tiles that were ready for painting. Another important purchase from this period was this panel by Cornelis Bouwmeester. Bouwmeester was trained as a seascape painter in the works of Van der Velde, and worked in paint as well as making pen drawings that Van der Velde was very famous for. He was based in Rotterdam, and you can see a lot of the skill and technique that he used as a pen painter reflected in this tile panel. For instance, when you look at the crests of the waves that have this beautiful drawn quality to them. In the course of the 1920s and early 30s, ideas about the presentation of art started to shift. The presentation of the Rijksmuseum was decluttered, and plaster casts and reproduction were removed, and there became a more emphasis on aesthetic and stylistic developments within each of the separate media. So collections were separated and made into a display much more recognizable to what we know today. Here we see the ceramics galleries in 1926, and they were in part reorganized because of the Laudon bequest, a very important collection of Delft that was donated to the museum in 1916, so a few years earlier. And here on the far left of the back wall, we see this highly important tile panel from the Laudon collection. And there is so much to unpack with this panel, and I'll just indicate a few elements of it. The tiles were probably made in Delft. The quality of the painting is incredibly high. The scene has very chinoiserie quality, but was actually based on the 16th century woodcut illustration of a famous Chinese novel, The Journey to the West. But the black figures that we see in the center were based on a completely different source. They were the inhabitants of the islands of Hispaniola and Brazil, and were taken from a kind of travelogue or description of the Americas, the Nieuwe en Onbekende Wereld, the New and Unknown World, that was published in Amsterdam in 1671. So it's an incredible sort of mashup of these different cultural elements. And it's not the only panel like this that we know of. There are a few more, and I'm sorry for the bad quality of the image here for the Brussels panel, but it just gives you an idea that more of these elements exist. And actually, the largest parts are found here in the kitchen of Amalienburg, a hunting lodge at Schloss Nymphenburg that was built in the 1730s for Amalie, the wife of Elector Karl Albrecht of Bavaria. It's been long assumed that all these tiles were part of a single decorative scheme. And the Nymphenburg kitchens give us an idea of how that would have looked like, but it's unlikely that Amalienburg was the original placement for it. Because it was built in the 1730s, so quite almost 30 years later than the tiles themselves. And also part of the tiles are placed in the wrong order. When you look carefully, you can even see it on the screen that there are some weird cutoffs, and so it's likely that they were assembled at Amalienburg rather than commissioned for it. But together, we do assume that this would have decorated a single room, and the idea of having this colorful decoration on this beautiful white background would have been a sort of wonderful equivalent of the lacquer cabinets that were very popular among the European ruling classes at this time. And I really think that the comparison to lacquer and the inversion of sort of black colorful decorations on a black background or a white background is really interesting. Unfortunately, we still don't know where it was made for, but so there's still so much research to do on this panel and this set of panels. The 1930s, we're going back to the museum now, were somewhat of a heyday for the tile collection of the museum. The Western courtyard was being reinstalled. Plaster models that were deemed not appropriate for a national museum anymore were being substituted by a large collection of tiles given on loan by the Amsterdam collector ARTIS-IHA. And here we see images of that remodeling in progress. And here we see an image of the collection of ARTIS-IHA being transported to the museum. Large tile collections in the Netherlands were created almost invariably after 1905. This had two reasons. In part, less Delftware was becoming on the market for collectors, and so they were looking for a new collecting field, but also new legislation on housing meant that old, dangerous and unhealthy housing in many city centers was being demolished and replaced. City councils could condemn houses and force owners to rebuild. And during this, many building materials, including antique tiles, would be salvaged. Many of these demolitions were even done on spec, so the builder or demolitioner would not get paid for the job, but would be paid in being allowed to resell the materials that he got from it. And one of the most important figures in this setting is Hein Hamer. He was a builder in Amsterdam who kind of created his own market for tile collectors. He, as a builder, he knew which houses were on the list for demolition, and he and his brother-in-law, the architect Kommer de Geus, would sell his best tiles to a few collectors whom they had themselves had groomed and advised in starting to collect tiles in the first place. Hammer was also the principal supplier to Eelco Vis, and a large part of his collection was bought by the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1922. And de Geus's pivotal book on Dutch tiles, Oud-Hollandische Vliezen, from 1926, is also based on the Vis collection. And so Isaac, the collections of Isaac and Vis had a very similar start in the grooming of Hein Hammer. The move to, and here we see an image of Isaac himself, who, oh, I'm so sorry, who was in fact a one of the founders of the Bijenkorf, the first the first department store in the Netherlands, and later in life focused much more on the collection of tiles. Like other hammer collectors, I would say, Isaac collected large groups of tiles specifically of a specific type, so that fields could be kept together, retaining the architectural character of the tiles much better than if they were shown individually. Here you see an example of that. Quickly, here you see the back of one of the Isaac tiles, because they're all framed exactly the same way, with a wooden frame and using a quite thick resin that is, the conservators tell me, incredibly difficult to remove. But it just shows you how this entire move to the museum was carefully prepared by him. Here we see one of the tile panels from the picture. And of course, you can see that very architectural element of these individual tiles only forming a shape when they're brought together. And this was, of course, a big difference between the way that they were shown in this courtyard was very much more art historical than what we saw earlier. It's a complete transformation compared to the period room display that we saw earlier. And it really fitted with new ideas about museums and ideas about how to display collections. The courtyard presentation was finished in 1933, which unfortunately meant that Isaac, who died the year before, never actually saw the display of his tiles at the Rijksmuseum, which is incredibly sad. The collection has a complicated history during the Second World War, because it was still on loan from the family to the museum, but was then essentially confiscated by the Nazis. And after a long and complicated period, it was finally donated to the museum by his children in 1955. One of the most significant acquisitions of tiles in the post-war years did not come from Isaac, but was purchased. And here, just another image showing you these wonderful early tiles. Another significant acquisition in these post-war years did not actually come from Isaac, but was purchased from an Amsterdam dealer. And of course, many of you will recognize this as coming from the famous, and I'm sorry, I'm going to butcher the Portuguese again, the Palacio Gavaro Mexica. And of course, other tile panels from this palace are now in the Tile Museum in Lisbon and the Amsterdam Historical Museum, which is actually on loan to the Prinsessenhof. Remnants of this period room approach are still visible in the museum display today in this so-called Dordtse betimmering. This entire wainscoting came from a house on the Gravenstraat in Dordrecht in the south of Holland. The house was demolished in 1868, and the paneling was subsequently sold to the museum. And even in the current display, it is used as a kind of architectural, it's used as an architectural element in the room, but much less as a setting for other objects than as a work of art in and of itself. But it's wonderful to see these early animal tiles that actually did come with it when it was taken from the house in Dordrecht. It's just really wonderful, and because we know that it has so much more authenticity, it's really interesting to compare that to the displays created in the early iterations of the Netherlands Museum. Other galleries have a very different character in the current museum, and tiles play a much more minor role there. Here we see the William and Mary Gallery, where the only tiles shown are the large panels that were made by the Rijkmuseum, a Delftware factory for the water gallery, Mary's private rooms at Hampton Court. Now, before 2003, so before the museum closed for the big renovation, we had a tile study collection in the museum itself. That has unfortunately not returned. What has returned are the so-called special collections, and they're a kind of combination display where we do show larger amounts of objects in a display kind of similar, similar to what you would expect in a traditional decorative arts museum, with lots of examples of a particular medium, a particular period, but presented in a way that we hope is a little bit more attractive to a general public that might not know so much about ceramics or tiles or silver or glass. And here we did incorporate some tiles, but it's not much, I must say. Here we see this beautiful panel that is the polychrome version of the Sommelsdijk panel that we just saw. Some wonderful 18th century Rotterdam tiles, and here the Bolsward panel again. And in 2019, we held a small presentation called Treasures from Storage, where tiles featured heavily. And you can see that display here in a few images. And it was actually only when I was working on this presentation that I realized the incredible similarities between the way that we presented the AzLab collection and that it was displayed in 1933. So it was, I guess it's the art historical tendency to order and organize was great in the 30s, as it still is today. Unfortunately, I don't see a presentation like this returning to the museum very soon, but we are very happy that we have we just opened a new storage facility called the Collection Center of the Netherlands, where we've brought together the institutional collections of 4 major institutions in the Netherlands that will be much more easily available to the public. They can be visited by the public much more than storage offsite storage facilities usually are. So I really hope that the opening of this building will become an opportunity to study tiles again with students, because we have a wonderful room there that we can use for presentations, for hands-on seminars, etc. So I really hope that the research and the availability of objects that are not on permanent display will become much stronger in the new building. But at the same time, we look for other opportunities as well. And this panel might be familiar to some of you because it was presented at the Glaze Art Symposium in Lisbon a few years ago by one of the conservators. It's a really rare example of an exterior wall decoration from 17th century Amsterdam. It came, as you can see on this drawing, from a house at the Bloemdwarsstraat in Amsterdam that was owned by a André Estre, who was a tile manufacturer. And here in this 19th century drawing, you can already see actually in quite a lot of detail that parts were already missing and tiles had been replaced. One tile has fallen off and other tiles have been replaced by blue and white tiles with figures on it. The panel was bought by the Royal Antiquarian Society in 1879, and this Royal Antiquarian Society was hugely important for the Rijksmuseum and also for that sort of cultural historical way of collecting. And it was placed actually in the meeting room of the society, and here you can see it on a picture from the 1920s, being where it was installed. The refurbishment of the Phillips wing, our exhibition wing, in 2015 meant that that room would become a gallery for photography, and so an extra wall had to be placed into it. And after due consideration, we decided rather than to cover it up with an extra wall, to take it out, because we felt that the risk of future generations forgetting that it was ever there and accidentally damaging it was too great. So it was taken out and conserved. Here you can see these incredible lines during and after restoration, and they're just incredible. These polychrome lions are so rare. But then, of course, we had this incredibly long tile panel, and we had to find a place for it, preferably not our storage. And then through the RCE, the Dutch Cultural Heritage Institute, we heard that the Gemeenlandshuis, so the building made for the water board of Zeeland and the Diemerdijk, and the water board was a kind of administrative body responsible for the care and maintenance of dikes in the area. So it was incredibly important keeping Amsterdam dry, literally. The building of the water board still stands on the Diemerdijk, is currently let out, but can be visited on occasion. And we felt it was a perfect solution to place the panel there. And this is quite a bad picture, but it actually does look great. And you can see that the tiles that were missing were replaced by simple white tiles, but that the whole has still an incredibly strong presence. So that's just to show you that even though in the museum our options are sometimes limited, we try to find creative solutions to ensure the continuous display and through display enthusiasm for tiles at the Rijksmuseum. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Femke. That was great. Mario Beck has a question.
Tile panels that were given a prominent place in the new presentation, restored and were remounted. What were the underlying main options for the choices made, as well as for the selection for non-restoration? So yeah, thank you for that question. Well, we looked at the condition of almost every object that went back on display after 2013, and the tiles that are currently on display were mostly remounted, but not all of them. And that in part has to do with the image of the back of the AzLab tiles I showed you. I feel the fact that they were mounted like this by the collector has a certain importance. And even though it's not possible to keep that in every instance, because the resin used to attach the tiles to the wood is sometimes is drying out too much, is becoming frail, and so in certain cases we've had to replace it, and then usually replace it with a honey weaved backboard that is relatively light. And I try to refrain from using frames. So a small metal frame if needed, but I really don't like sort of making little paintings of tiles. So yeah, so I do feel that the way that the AzLab tiles are framed is important historical document. And at the same time, the condition of many of the tiles is not great. And so to put them on display, they do often need extra treatment. And then every time it's a really difficult discussion of whether we have to remount or not. But we try to be careful with that, but it is sometimes necessary, especially when that brownish resin is very apparent. You don't want to do anything where you're conserving over the resin and just sort of creating layers upon layers. So then we do have to remount. See the pomegranate motif again? Yes, of course. Here you go. Yeah.
Carla, do you want to say something, or
just enjoy?
Or not, just yes.
Thank you so much. I was enjoying so much, and I was trying to make a comparison with other kind of motifs that I already saw in other panels of glaze tiles. That's why I wanted to see better some details on this drawing. It's really beautiful, this pattern. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. And this is sort of this whole group of early 17th century tiles with polychrome decorations that are in a way much more connected to sort of the what we in the Netherlands very confusingly call majolica, so the earlier polychrome Latin glaze decorations on earthenware. Are really incredible, and apart from the pomegranates, you have motifs with tazas with grapes in them, with flowers, and they're absolutely extraordinary. Yeah. And we're so lucky to have, as I showed in the presentation, you need these larger panels to really understand what's going on with these. And luckily, these early collections that were founded around 1900 often had that, and it gives us the opportunity to study that further.
Thank you so much. Very kind of you.
No problem. And for everyone, I think almost all the tiles we have in the museum can be found directly through our collection database on the website of the Rijksmuseum.
Thank you, Carla, and thank you, Femke. Yeah. So I think we have another question from Anna Almeida.
Yeah. Debate about is there a debate in the Rijksmuseum about how to display architectural elements such as tiles in a museum context? So yes, as I showed, we struggle a lot with these objects that came from these period room displays that are sometimes difficult to display by themselves because they need the context. And so what we often see happening is that we focus on the few objects where we are more certain about sort of the authenticity of the ensemble, like the Dordrecht wainscoting that I showed, but there are examples in the 18th century as well. And so we tend to focus on those rooms, but the problem with that is that a lot of objects that were initially collected for these more picturesque period rooms of the early museums then never end up leaving storage. And so for the exhibition that I'm currently working on about the interior in the 17th century, we're struggling with exactly that we don't want to create these sort of 19th century period rooms to talk about the interior, but at the same time, you need the context of how these objects would have functioned to understand them. So yeah, I think it's a continuous debate, and I think if the presentation shows anything, is that it really is a pendulum of looking more at these displays where you interpret a lot for the audience and make it more of a cultural history, and these more strictly art historical displays. And of course, for the Rijksmuseum, that is at the same time the National Museum for History and Art, this is a particularly interesting struggle because we've never been an art museum, purely an art museum. And so these two tendencies it's always a bit of a struggle, but I think it's, but also very, very important. So yeah, we're looking around at sort of best practices a lot. We have, in the new display, the current display, we have incorporated architectural elements such as chimneys, but also furniture with, for instance, sets of vases on it. So that's a nod to those displays, but in a very modern setting, so that it doesn't become stuffy. I would. But yeah, but if anyone has a brilliant solution for this, I would be very, very happy to hear it. But for now, it's a continuous struggle.
Here's another question from Mario.
So is the entire collection digitally accessible or only part of it? Almost entirely. We're working on it. So our goal is to have everything digitally available. And I think for the tile collection, we're almost there, but it's a continuous process, a continuing process. But even compared to a few years ago, when there were hardly any tiles in the museum database, now you can find a lot. It's often it's sort of, you have to fiddle around with the search terms a little bit to get them out of the system, but yeah, they're there.
Okay, nice to know.
I know the museum has some Portuguese tiles in the collection, and are they being studied, or can we contribute, for example, to improving the information you provide on the website?
Yes, please. Yeah, no, they, I think the last time anyone really looked at them carefully was in the mid-80s. So, so yes, please. And we're continuously updating the information, but sometimes you really need a sort of focused moment to do so. So perhaps let this be the start of something wonderful, because yeah, I mean, the problem with a lot of these displays or these digital databases are incredibly helpful and so important for research, and at the same time sometimes it's difficult because the information given is outdated, or I mean, we have examples of tiles where the information that's in our very advanced registration system actually is the exact same information that was in the inventory card written in the 1860s, and nothing happens in the meantime. So yes, if you see any mistakes, if there is anything, please we'd be very, very grateful. Another question: is there a publication? Well, there are a few articles written by my predecessor, and there are, of course, the wonderful sort of general books on tiles, Dutch tiles written by, for instance, Mr. Spranger. So those I can definitely recommend, but there's not a collection catalog as of yet. So that's well, when I'm finished with the Delft, where I'll hopefully have time for that.
Are there any more questions? We already talked about this, but you participated in research projects about the Rijksmuseum collections, of course, to get to know its collection. But how is the research on the collection promoted outside the museum, that is within academia? Are there researchers studying the museum tiles, for example, for PhDs or master degrees?
Well, in I think this answer is sort of twofold. I think in general we struggle a bit with finding academic interest in the decorative arts in a way that is applicable to museums. We luckily have one of our curators is an adjunct professor at the University of Leiden, and so some of his students do come to the collection, and we've had research projects with master's students for specific exhibitions, which is really wonderful. But in general, it's quite hard to find sort of academic interest for these decorative arts subjects that need a lot of connoisseurship before you can even start asking other questions, because it takes a long time, and students are often trained more in the direction of paintings. On the other hand, we have a collaboration in terms of material research and conservation called the NICAS. And within that project, and also in the collaborations with the University of Amsterdam and our own conservation scientists, research is being done on tiles, most importantly by Kate van Loken Campagne, who is studying the entire production of tiles, and from a very material standpoint, but who was also doing great historical research. So I think there's a bit of a there are two trends there. One, sort of from the material sciences point of view, research is being done, especially by Kate, but art historically, it's a little bit more difficult. We're hoping to bring those worlds. I mean, NICAS, the research funding is specifically directed towards bringing those worlds together, finding communal questions to ask objects that you really need the art historical and the scientific views for. But that's not always easy. But I think it's really important that we keep finding each other there.
Thank you again, Femke, for this amazing evening, and thank you all for joining us. I would like just to remind you that the next AzLab will be on November 24th with Serenella Cecchini from the Victoria and Albert Museum to talk about the Portuguese tiles in the V&A collection. So, have a very nice evening or afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. And thank you again, Femke, and see you soon.
Thank you. And if anyone has any questions about particular tiles in our collection, please feel free to email me, and I'm sure my email address can be shared among this group.